This is E. Nakamichi, President of Nakamichi Research, speaking to you from our Santa Monica office. This is the first in the series of a news cassette entitled Nakamichi Spoken Here, in which we hope to answer various questions about our company and our products, and to keep you informed of the most recent developments here at Nakamichi. As most of you know, we are entering our third year of operation in the United States. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our dealers for the support you have given us in our efforts. With this news cassette concept, we hope to increase the flow of information and thus increase the level of mutual cooperation between you and us. I now wish to introduce to you Mr. Harold Appleman, our engineering and marketing consultant. Harold received his engineering and marketing background in the Boston area. He graduated from MIT. He is an accomplished violinist, having served as concertmaster of the Greater Boston Youth Symphony and the MIT Symphony Orchestras. And of course, he has always been a devoted audiophile. I consider him one of the golden years of our organization. Starting this fall, Helen will be stationed in Europe at our liaison office in the Rotterdam. In this matter, we hope to begin a global exchange of Nakamichi news. I hope you will feel free to write to Mr. Appleman with your suggestions and questions. You can always reach him through our Santa Monica office. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamichi. I met many of you at this year's CES in Chicago. I hope in time to get to know all of you and to be able to work closely with you, our dealers. In this tape, we want to cover in a Q&A format some of the most asked questions about Nakamichi Research, our products, and our philosophies. In future editions of Nakamichi Spoken Here, we intend to cover topics such as our 3-microphone recording system, our thoughts on monitor loudspeakers, and other topics largely based, we hope, on suggestions from you. In this first edition, we have an awful lot we want to cover, and this tape is liable to run a little longer than we originally planned. You may not have the time to take it all in one sitting, but please do take the time to listen to it in its entirety. We think you'll find it informative, and above all, we are anxious to get feedback from you. One of the most frequently asked questions is just who is Nakamichi Research and what do they do other than make expensive cassette decks? Well, Mr. Nakamichi, from whom you just heard a moment ago, started a small research and development company in 1947 with a few of his close friends, all experts in their respective fields. The company concentrated on strict R&D in electronics, electromagnetics, and physics. We didn't begin manufacturing until the early 60s, when we made a variety of tape recorders for a variety of brands. In the mid-60s, we started focusing our efforts on cassette machines, and by 1970, we were working solely on cassette equipment. In 1972, we started selling our cassette decks under the Nakamichi brand. The company has grown quite a bit since 1947, but relatively speaking, we're still small. Our products, however, are the results of many years of research and experience in magnetic recording technology. Our continuing research includes areas other than audio, such as digital systems. Many of you familiar with our head technology, for example, know that we have no peers as far as heads are concerned. Nakamichi Research is always at work to maintain that kind of technological edge over our competitors. We're often asked, why don't you make an open reel machine? It's true that with our background, we should be able to make an excellent open reel unit, but there are many fine open reel machines on the market. Were we to put an open reel deck on the market, it would undoubtedly be considered one of the best. We don't really feel the need, though, to make another Revox. Instead, we realized long ago, when the cassette medium was not yet considered a format for serious tape recording, that cassettes had a tremendous potential, and that with our engineering capabilities, we should be able to change a lot of minds about cassettes. In short, the potential and the challenge that we saw in cassettes kept us away from open reel. Well, after hearing that reply, a lot of people then ask about our philosophy in general. There are a number of related concepts that together form our operating philosophy. The first is that we're not ever content to be just one of the best. Our design philosophy, secondly, dictates that our equipment have the lowest possible coloration. That is, the machine must perform its function without adding its own sound to the signal. We want our products to represent long-term investments. We won't be introducing new models to supersede previous models every year. There will, of course, be improvements made, but our basic guaranteed specifications will remain unchanged. And since we're selling performance and not specifications, we never make false claims. Our specifications are very conservative. This becomes immediately obvious to anyone reading any of the independent test reports in the magazines of our machines. Let's get down to the machines themselves. Many ask, what made you decide on using 3 heads, or why do I need 3 heads? The most common answer is that 3 heads give you off-the-tape monitoring capability while recording. Well, that's only part of the answer. The truth is that off-the-tape monitoring is just a side benefit of having 3 heads. Those tape recorder experts among you know how much easier it is to set up a machine, and by that I mean adjusting bias, equalization, record levels, aligning the heads, and so forth. How much easier to set up a machine with 3 heads than it is to do the same with a 2-head recorder. That's another fringe benefit. The real plus of 3 heads comes from the fact that a 2-head design necessarily represents a compromise in performance. There is an optimum head gap for record and an optimum head gap for playback. There is also an optimum magnetic material for the record head as there is for the playback head. 3 heads allows optimization of these factors separately for record and playback. The results are extended high-frequency response, better signal-to-noise ratio, and lower distortion. So why didn't all other cassette makers think of 3 heads from the start, you ask? Well, the answer is that it's not that easy. We introduced our Model 1000 at the New York Hi-Fi Show in October of 1972. Before that, went at least 5 years of intensive research and development. Today, almost 3 years since we introduced the Model 1000, there is no other unit on the market, except our own Model 700, that can compete with it performance-wise. That should give you an idea how difficult it is to come up with a good 3-head cassette deck. It takes a combination of high-quality heads, the proper tape drive mechanisms such as our differential drive dual capstan system, and top-notch electronics to succeed with 3 heads. Speaking of 3 heads, we are often asked, why is there a user-adjustable record head azimuth on the 1000 and 700? The 3-head open-reel machines don't have that feature. Well, to understand why, you have to realize that one major difference between open-reel and cassette is that in the case of the cassette, part of the tape traveling mechanism is separated from the tape deck transport. Every time you change cassettes, you change part of the mechanism that is normally a permanent installation on open-reel transports. The thing is that cassettes aren't nearly as precise or consistent as we'd like them to be. Different cassettes, even among the same brand, or what's even worse, different sides of the same cassette have different tape traveling characteristics. This becomes particularly critical in 3-head designs. The record head may be aligned properly with respect to the playback head for one cassette, but not for another. You don't have this problem with 2-head machines because the record head and the playback head are one and the same. 3-head cassette decks without user-adjustable record head azimuth can't possibly perform well. Our experience shows it's better to stick to 2 heads if you're not going to provide this feature. What's maybe a tough question for a lot of salesmen to answer is, what accounts for the $450 price difference between the Model 1000 and the Model 700? The specs are the same, and I can't believe the DNL and the auto rewind features added up to $450. Well, the customer who asked that would be right about that. The DNL and the auto rewind do not add up to $450. So let me explain it this way. The Nakamichi 1000 was originally developed as a dream machine. It's a no-compromise machine from the standpoints of performance, ease of use, convenience features, and serviceability. It's an extravagant unit. Cost was no object. Although it received high critical acclaim, there was clearly a demand for a more reasonably priced machine with similar performance. So we developed the Model 700. The 700 is basically the production version of the 1000. We dropped the DNL and the auto rewind and designed the 700 so that it could be manufactured with fewer production steps. But we kept the specs the same. It wasn't easy, but it comes down to this. The 1000 goes through more inspections and adjustments than the 700. The 1000 uses hand-selected heads and other critical parts. Although the specs are the same, in the case of the Model 1000, the specs are guaranteed minimum. The 1000, in other words, is built and adjusted to closer tolerances. Can you hear the difference between a 1000 and a 700? Yes, you can, but you'd have to use the best available amplifier and speakers, and you have to have some pretty critical ears. I mentioned DNL a moment ago, but I didn't really explain what it is. I'm sure you're often asked, what's DNL? How does it differ from Dolby? Well, DNL, which stands for Dynamic Noise Limiter, is a playback-only noise reduction system. Dolby is an entire record-playback process. A tape which was recorded using Dolby must be played back with Dolby circuitry. Playback Dolby does you no good if you get a tape which is noisy and was not recorded with Dolby. That's where DNL is useful. If you have to play a noisy tape that wasn't Dolby encoded, or if the tape was recorded with Dolby but it's noisy anyway, presumably because the original source was noisy, well, in those cases you'll find DNL handy. DNL works completely independent of Dolby. I should mention that DNL can reduce some of the high frequency content of a recording, so although it's a lot better than the high filters found in most amplifiers, it should nevertheless be used with discretion. Let's talk about two-head cassette decks. What's usually asked here is, okay, Nakamichi also makes two-head cassette decks. What's so different about the Model 500, for example, compared to other two-head decks? Well, in order to answer that question, I should first explain what led to the development of the Model 500. Our research in head design led to the development of the focused gap head, a unique head that enables a signal to be recorded on the entire thickness of the tape without giving up stray and superfluous magnetic energy. Although, as I said earlier, two-head designs always represent compromises, it occurred to us that using this focus gap head, we could make a two-head cassette machine with frequency response, dynamic range, and distortion far superior to any other two-head deck on the market. What makes the 500 different, therefore, is performance. There are some features, of course, like our 45 dB range peak reading meters, but that's not the main thing. Other manufacturers can copy features easily. In fact, the 45 dB peak reading meters are already appearing on other machines. But the performance of the 500 cannot be so easily copied. The Nakamichi 500's superior performance may not be immediately obvious by reading and comparing specifications, and there's a reason for this. Many cassette deck manufacturers perform their record playback frequency response measurements at 30 dB or more below the 0 dB recording level. I'm referring to the Dolby level. They have to do this to obtain decent frequency response specifications because their heads are of marginal quality. The high frequency response becomes dramatically worse at higher recording levels. And by higher recording levels, I mean minus 20 to minus 10 dB or so. Our frequency response spec is measured at minus 20, the level used by almost all the independent testing laboratories for evaluating cassette recorders. Most manufacturers cover up for their machine's shortcomings by using devices such as frequency compensated meters. Those are the meters that intentionally read higher at high frequencies, or by setting the 0 on their record level meters a few dB lower than standard Dolby level. You might have noticed some machines have Dolby calibration marks at plus 3 dB or higher. Some manufacturers actually go so far as to recommend in their instruction manuals that you do not exceed minus 10 or so on the level meter when recording. All this will give you better high frequency response, but only at the expense of a poor signal to noise ratio. If you record 10 dB lower, your signal noise will be 10 dB worse. The peak level meters on the 500 have flat frequency responses. The 0 dB point on the meter is the Dolby calibration point. You can record right up to the red, and sometimes even a bit higher depending on the source material and what kind of tape you're using, with our machines, without fear of losing highs. What I'm talking about will become very clear if you compare the Model 500 to any other machine by taking frequency response measurements or just recording music with a lot of highs at or near the true 0 dB mark. So now you say, that's great, and the Nakamichi 550 is the portable version of the 500, right? We'd have to say, sorry, but you're wrong. The only similarity between the two is the transport, and even that isn't exactly the same. The 550 was designed along different lines from the very start. It was designed in direct reply to the request from owners of Nakamichi machines who also owned a portable cassette deck. They were generally dissatisfied with the portable unit's performance, inadequate battery life. Some units can't record both sides of a C90 cassette with a set of fresh batteries. Inadequate headphone amplifier power. They claim that the built-in monaural speaker was fairly useless for monitoring, and we agree. poor microphone preamplifiers, usually with far too much noise and inadequate dynamic range, and the lack of a reliable footage indicator. Well, the 550 can record continuously for 15 hours on a set of standard dry cell batteries. It has no built-in speaker, but it does have a headphone amp that can pump 300 milliwatts per channel into 8-ohm headphones, and that's pretty loud with most dynamic headphones. The 3 low-noise microphone preamps each have over 125 dB of dynamic range, and with the push of a button, the left channel peak level meter becomes an accurate tape footage indicator that reads out the amount of tape used in percent. As far as performance goes, the 550 is a Model 500 plus a bit more. It's naturally more rugged than a 500. In addition, the transport was redesigned to operate stably, whether it's vertical, horizontal, upside down, or sideways. The electronics were specially designed to conserve as much power as possible. Both the transport and the electronics were built to withstand and perform equally well in relative extremes in ambient temperature. Above all, though, it's a component-grade cassette deck. We'd have to say that it's the best 2-head cassette deck on the market, portable or not. It happens to offer the added convenience of portability. Incidentally, the 550 is well suited not only for out-of-doors recording, but for playback as well. Those customers who desire speakers should consider purchasing an ADS 2001 system. One of our most satisfied customers is Stevie Wonder. We came across this sentence in a recent Washington Post article on Stevie Wonder, and I quote, "Over his shoulder is a constant companion, an 8-pound Nakamichi cassette machine, his electronic notebook for new lyrics and melodies." Unquote. By the way, for those of you who couldn't make it to our suite at the CES, we've just introduced a hard case for the 550. It will retail for $50, and we think it'll be a big seller. Speaking of the 550, we often get questions on the various features of the machine, since some of them are unusual. How do you manage to get such long battery life out of the machines? Is a very popular one. Well, it's a combination of an extremely efficient DC to DC converter. It's over 90% efficient. Our duty cycle controlled DC servo motor drive system, and our power conserving electronics. We have a technical bulletin, Nakamichi Technical Bulletin number 1, that deals with the various features of the 550 at a somewhat more sophisticated level. Those of you looking for more technical explanations should consult that bulletin. Another common 550 question is, how do you get the level meter to read out footage? Well, here again, for a really complete explanation, you should consult our technical bulletin number 1. Basically, though, it works like this. There's a pulley with a magnet on it that's belt-driven by the take-up spindle, and that's the right-hand spindle. The magnet provides 2 pulses per rotation to a head specially positioned to pick up these pulses. Now, depending on how much tape there is on the take-up spool in the cassette, the interval between the successive pulses will vary. Special circuitry translates the intervals between the pulses to a voltage that can then be read on the meter. The programming timer and the end alarm light, by the way, works off the same circuit. One question we often get from audiophiles who have not done much live recording is, if the recorder itself has a 60 dB signal-to-noise ratio, why is it necessary to have microphone inputs with dynamic ranges greater than 60 dB? Or more specifically, why does the Nakamichi 550 have mic inputs with over 125 dB dynamic range? If all microphones came in one standard sensitivity and all sound sources limited themselves to a prescribed sound pressure level, you wouldn't need wide dynamic range mic preamps. But it's not like that in real life. Microphones come in all sorts of sensitivities, and sound sources vary in output from a very soft harpsichord on up to a very loud steam locomotive. Some mic preamps found on otherwise reputable machines cannot handle the high output of a condenser microphone without the use of an attenuator. The mic preamp will clip long before you reach the 0 dB record level. Using an attenuator means you have to increase gain, which in turn means you have to increase noise. With wide dynamic range mic preamps, such as those found on the 550, you'll never need to use attenuators with normally encountered sound sources, even when using highly sensitive condenser microphones. At the same time, you have more than enough gain to handle the lower sensitivity dynamic mics. A lot of 550 owners and others thinking of buying a 550 ask us, why don't you incorporate rechargeable batteries as a standard feature, or at least offer them as an option? Well, we'd have to answer that by asking a question. Have you really done a lot of portable recording using rechargeable batteries? If you have, you probably wouldn't be asking that question. Aside from the fact that we've never really been convinced that rechargeable batteries are so convenient, our main complaint lies in the poor discharge characteristics of nickel-cadmium batteries. This is particularly true in low ambient temperature recording situations. We wouldn't want to endorse anything that could result in ruined recordings. There are a number of questions often asked of us that deal with our machines in general, not just particular models. I guess the one we most often hear is, why do all your machines have 3 microphone inputs? Others only have 2. To answer that properly, I'd have to go into a long explanation of our 3 microphone system for stereo recording. Rather than go into that now, I'm going to leave that for our next news cassette, where we'll deal with at greater length with the recording end. Another question we often hear from live recording fans is, why don't Nakamichi cassette decks have balanced mic inputs like the professional studio machines? Well, we have nothing against balanced mic inputs, except for one small thing, and I'll mention that later. And we fully acknowledge the fact that balanced lines are often necessary when running long cables to cut down on hum and noise pickup. What we do object to is the thinking that a balanced line always sounds better than an unbalanced line. The truth is that since a balanced line requires a transformer at the mic preamp input, and since even the best of transformers color the sound, an unbalanced line should sound better. For this reason, many professionals are now bypassing the input transformers on their mixing consoles and going with unbalanced lines whenever possible to avoid transformer coloration. That's the only objection we have to balanced lines. We have a professional version of our Model 1000 called the Studio Z. I think most of you know about it. And although it provides fully balanced Canon connector inputs and outputs, all the unbalanced inputs and outputs were kept operational to give the professional user the choice. What exactly are peak reading meters, and how do they differ from conventional VU meters, is another question asked quite frequently. The meters on all our cassette machines are true peak reading types with flat frequency responses. They are capable of registering even the most instantaneous peaks encountered in recording sources. Conventional VU meters, which are found on the majority of tape recorders in the market, can't react quickly enough to register such peaks. What you find a lot of these days is a LED peak indicator that's meant to be used in conjunction with the VU meter. And while this helps prevent overloading of the tape while recording, we think that most users will find our peak reading meters much easier to use. Just to give you an idea, a VU meter usually takes about 3/10 of a second to swing from -20 to 0 VU. The meters in the 550, for example, can travel from -40 to 0 dB in about 120 milliseconds. On a given peak, that means there can be as much as 8 dB difference in what the VU meter reads versus what our meters read. Our meters will be reading higher, of course. That 8 dB can spell the difference between a clean recording and a distorted one. Why do I need a 45 dB range on the meters? Well, you don't need it, but it makes setting and monitoring levels a lot easier. Just try going back to any other kind of metering system after you've gotten used to ours, and you'll see what I mean. Music rarely confines itself to a 20 dB dynamic range. Meters that hover around the low end of the scale most of the time, only to jump up to the red occasionally, are really hard to use, I think, and they're not really providing very much useful information most of the time. Some people then ask, okay, alright, if your meters are so good, why do you provide peak limiters on your machines? Well, that's a good question. Our peak limiter is a very fast-acting compressor that attenuates peaks above the plus 3 dB point at a linear ratio of 1 to 7, or in terms of dB, 1 to 17. That means a signal peak coming in at at plus 20 dB, for example, will be reduced to plus 4 dB by the peak limiter, so that you won't get the gross saturation of the tape. You shouldn't have to use the limiter when dubbing from records or off the air. Records and FM broadcasts are already compressed. You'll never run across a dynamic range of more than, say, 50 dB with either. Now, live recording is another matter. Very often, you don't know in advance just how the levels are going to go. That's where the peak limiter is useful. No matter how good your meters are, they can't help you forecast unexpected peaks. Speaking of tape for a moment now, we're constantly asked, what cassette tapes do you recommend? The answer is, why, Nakamichi brand tape, of course. But we're not just saying that to be clever. For one thing, all our cassette decks are adjusted for our tape, so if you want to be assured that you're getting the guaranteed minimum specifications out of your Nakamichi machine, you should use our tape. We want people to understand that we are not tape manufacturers. We issue tape for our own protection. Complaints about machines are all too often traced to problems with the cassettes themselves. We have to be in a position to say, use our tape and see if the problem persists. If not, then the tape and the machine is not the machine is at fault. We are in close contact with Japan's leading tape manufacturers. We have them manufacture Nakamichi brand tape to special quality control standards which we specify. It's difficult for us to recommend cassette tapes because of the problems with housings that I mentioned before, as well as problems with the tapes themselves. Tape manufacturers frequently change specifications and characteristics without notice. Even the best tape, furthermore, can vary depending on when and where it was manufactured. We've eliminated these problems by insisting on strict quality control. There are a number of good cassette tape brands on the market. We suggest making your own comparisons using our tape as a reference and arriving at your own conclusions. Still on the subject of cassette tapes, we're often asked, which is better, Nakamichi Chrome or Nakamichi EX? Well, if you put it that way, we'd have to admit a slight preference for EX. With EX, you have less headwear, lower distortion, extended high-frequency response, and better consistency because although the chromium dioxide technology has come a long way, there are still problems with the coating process. We make our chrome tape available, though, because some prefer the lower noise level it affords. What we'd really like to recommend you try, though, is our new EX2 tape. It's a completely different ferric cobalt formulation. Compared to our EX, it has even lower distortion, greater dynamic range, resulting from an increased maximum output level and sensitivity, and a lower noise level. It can be used at the same bias and equalization settings as EX. Now, what about ferrochrome tapes? Well, you'll notice that none of our cassette decks have ferrochrome bias and equalization settings. We can't, in all honesty, recommend ferrochrome tapes, at least for now. All the problems with just the chromium dioxide coating become compounded when in the case of ferrochrome, because double coating requires super thin layers. Our main objections to currently available ferrochrome tapes is the very poor quality control and consistency, the excessive dropout, fluctuating distortion levels, and instability at the crossover point, which is the area where the ferric and the chrome overlap. For a more detailed discussion, please refer to Nakamichi Technical Bulletin number 3. Well, that's about it for this time. Thanks for staying with me to the end. Future editions of the Nakamichi Spoken Here will be shorter, I promise. The content of future tapes, by the way, will be largely determined by your questions and comments. I hope you'll feel free to write to me, care of our Santa Monica office, about anything concerning Nakamichi. The reverse side of this cassette is a demonstration tape. All the material was taken from live recordings mastered on Nakamichi cassette recorders. The first thing on the reverse side is the steam locomotive recording that many of you have asked for. It's intended mainly as a demonstration of dynamic range. You should play it at as high a level as possible without harming the associated equipment. We can't be responsible for speakers that you blow up with this tape. The rest of the demonstrations are various music sources, and levels should be adjusted according to preferences. We think you'll agree that whether it's capturing the full dynamic range of the steam locomotive or all the transient peaks of a harpsichord, this kind of sound can't be found on discs or on tapes made with high-speed duplication. This entire tape was dubbed at 1 7/8 inches per second on an unmodified Nakamichi 1000.
Thank you.